we are already at session 6 for the day. Now, this session is a panel discussion on strengthening consumer protection in post-COVID-19 digitization wave. Now, pandemic brought in a paradigm shift in customers' adoption of digital financial services, especially the payment services. Now, this adoption too has reached the last mile where lack of information and awareness has turned into a key concern with this change in consumer behavior. The challenge of customer protection is back and in need to reinvent consumer protection methodologies in the industry holds the key to the future. Now, this session focuses on how financial services and providers and regulators view this challenge. This session will be moderated by Sarayu Natarajan, founder at Aapti Institute. Welcome to the discussion, Sarayu. Now, joining Sarayu on this panel is Nath Parmeshwaran, Director of Corporate Affairs at PayPal India. It is good to see you, Nath, and welcome to the discussion. Also joining the session is Beni Chugh, Research Manager at Dvara Research. Welcome to the discussions, Beni. And now completing the panel is Ranjeeta Dubey, General Manager at RBI. It is good to have you join us for this discussion, Ranjeeta. And with that, I would like to hand over this session to Sarayu. Over to you, Sarayu.
Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome all to this panel discussion on strengthening consumer protection in the COVID-19 digitization age. Thank you to UNCDF, the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and SingX, and to all the attendees for this very timely and important panel. Like I mentioned, one of the joys of webinars is that people from all over the world can attend. But it's also a challenge because you don't know what you're competing with. It's lunch hour here in India, so thank you to the attendees for making this, making it here. This is a timely and important panel, if I may say so myself. COVID-19, the pandemic has heralded a wave of digitization, and more people globally, as well as in India, are using a range of new digital products and services. India has benefited enormously from having a backbone digital infrastructure, which has allowed many companies, many private corporations to innovate and innovate as a part of the ecosystem. Digitization has also meant the entry of newer and newer segments into a digital world. These newer segments have varying vulnerabilities, varying levels of access to technology, varying levels of data endowment, as well as capacities. And this means that the margins of technology and exclusion are shifting. So the aged, women, persons with disabilities, all experience a range of vulnerabilities which we need to really understand. What this also means is that we must be paying more attention to intersectionality, which is the layering or the coming together of multiple disadvantages. Another framing thought here is that the sector itself is shifting towards greater inclusion, from greater health, greater financial health from frames of inclusion. While the definition of financial health is evolving, we need to move beyond inclusion, and that's clear. So this panel in thinking about consumer protection from these frames is very, very relevant. But to make the shift from consumer protection towards inclusion and for consumer protection to be an integral part of financial products and technologies, for everybody to have greater security, freedom, trust, and control, we need to start speaking, and we need to start speaking across silos now. How do we learn of consumer interests? What underlies trust for consumers? What are the existing regulatory pathways and initiatives? What constraints and opportunities exist at the industry level? For us to be able to unpack all of these questions, we are joined by three fantastic panelists. We want to move this from mere rhetoric to actually having some kind of answers. So we're joined by three fantastic panelists. I'm not going to read out full bios because I guess very many of their organizations and these individuals themselves don't need too much of an introduction. But first, Ms. Ranjeeta Dubey, who's a career central banker and currently General Manager of the Consumer Protection and Education Department of the Reserve Bank of India. The RBI is India's central bank and a regulator as well. We're joined by Mr. Nath Parmeshwaran, who is Head of Corporate Affairs at PayPal India, and Ms. Beni Chugh, who's a Research Manager in the Future of Finance Group at Dvara Research. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarayu. We are very happy to be here.
Right. So just in terms of the structure of this discussion, we have about 45 to 50 minutes. of discussion, which is a healthy amount of time. And so I have a few questions for the panelists, and then we can continue to pick on the threads and themes that are brought up in the conversation and carry them forward. My first question, of course, is to Ms. Ranjeeta. The RBI has frameworks of consumer protection and consumer rights, and it has articulated a Charter of Consumer Rights. But one of the things that we all know from the work that we do is that this is very different in reality. So if you could speak to a little bit of what the breakdowns that consumers experience are to get us started, would love to have that discussion.
As you mentioned, the Charter of Customer Rights that the RBI has put in place, which includes right to fair treatment, right to transparency, fair and honest dealing, right to privacy, right to suitability, and the right and compensation. So basically, these rights comprise of broad overarching principles that all the financial service providers need to adopt. And these have been playing a very important role in protecting the interest of the consumers. So it is, RBI has adopted a customer-centric policy focus for all the customers of the financial service providers. And just to give you a background of what it actually consists of currently, is that it ensures that they adhere to all the directions on customer services. There are various directions on various gamuts of the activities that various financial service providers undertake that are regulated by RBI. Then, it has a separate vertical for consumer protection. And this vertical ensures that, it focuses on providing a level playing field between suppliers and consumers of finance, mainly towards removing or easing out of imbalances coming out of information asymmetries, then inadequate disclosures from financial services providers, and unfair treatment. So these rights cover most of these issues that the vertical looks after. As an instance, I will tell you, with the changing landscape, along with the other guidelines on customer services, RBI introduced the security and risk mitigation measures for electronic payment transactions. So ensuring velocity checks by financial service providers. Then, some liabilities that the regulated entities would have to take for unauthorized transactions, so that these liabilities for the customers are limited to a certain extent. Then, we recently, the RBI came up with instructions on limiting the third-party transaction limits, ensuring those customers that did not want, products like cardless, a contactless card, they should not be given such kinds of cards. They could switch on and off their cards at any point in time. They could decide the time at which they would bank, etc. So, coming at the bank has been looking at granular issues on where customers are actually facing problems. It is exhorting the financial service providers to adopt a fair practice code so that, even before, during, and after onboarding such customers, the entities should adopt a fair methodology. So, going ahead, however, one noted that despite all this, there have been many customer protection issues. So, in order to ensure that the customer got a second chance for his complaint or his grievance to be seen, the RBI introduced the internal ombudsman scheme. And this scheme, what it does is that it prevents, by ensuring that at apex level of every regulated entity, there is an internal ombudsman who looks at all the complaints which are either partially or completely rejected by the entity, so that the complainant gets a second chance. And, so this ensures that, his interests are protected. Now, despite this, if there is still there is a rejection or a partial rejection, the person can, there is an alternate grievance redressal that RBI itself offers in terms of the banking ombudsman scheme. And currently, we are operating with 3 schemes: the banking ombudsman scheme, the ombudsman scheme for non-banking financial services, and that for the digital transactions. Further, for any entity which is not covered under the ombudsman scheme, we have the consumer education and protection cells at 30 offices. So this is how we're looking at consumer education and protection. And as Governor announced in the monetary policy, now what one is looking at is providing some disincentives to the regulated entities. So wherever one with this will involve more of transparency, as in more data about complaints would have to be released by the regulated entities. Regulated entities would be subject to certain disincentives in terms of monetary penalties that could be imposed on them. If there could be certain peer group classification, and if there is a certain threshold above which the complaints are received, one would look at those issues. Further, so these are the things. I don't know whether you would want me to talk about awareness currently or maybe after.
Perhaps we could pick that up after Beni talks about the research on the ground as well, which is so. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. That's very interesting to understand the regulatory framework and the pathways that exist currently for consumer protection. My next question is to Beni. I'd love to understand a little bit more about the research you are doing on the ground, because part of consumer protection frameworks is also understanding the aspirations and the needs of consumers and understanding that in a differentiated way. So both innovation as well as regulation can begin to address those things. So if you could talk about the research that you are doing at the Future of Finance Group, Beni, I would appreciate that very much.
Clearly not used to unmuting myself, sorry. Thanks, Sarayu. Thanks, Ranjeeta. I'm just picking from what is at hand. I mean, there's definitely a range of research that I can probably contribute with, but just chiming on the grievance redress point that ma'am made. I think increasingly of digital finance, what COVID perhaps has done is that it has, maybe due to lack of opportunity and alternatives, it has migrated large swathes of people onto digital. I think the challenge now is to kind of keep them on digital, right? How do they continue to prefer digital over cash? And so in some sense, we're not optimizing for business models so much as we're optimizing for consumers' trust now, because the onboarding has happened due to one natural event. If that's the case, then we do feel that effective grievance redress is definitely key to kind of holding people onto the digital platform. Like ma'am mentioned, from the governors, from the RBI and the government's side, there have been initiatives that also kind of extend the regulatory perimeter. So entities that were previously not in the regulatory perimeter have now been added to, let's say, the banking ombudsman, be it digital lenders, people who are not directly in the purview of the RBI, can now be actually kind of held accountable for malpractices at the time of extending loans. And all of these are very welcome steps. But I'll just say that grievance redress does appear to be a lot more, underprivileged both by providers and by regulators. So we are in the way of a primary study. It's a 3,000 people study focusing especially on low-income individuals in rural Madhya Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. And the findings there suggest that only about 50% of respondents would ever approach a financial institution if they wanted to seek redress. The other 50% would not even think of going to, move the financial institution for redressal. And I think as providers, as consumer advocates, as regulators, that's like a huge awakening point for us. When we go into the causes a bit deeper, this is of course desk research and not primary research. We do understand that ombudsman processes tend to be a little complicated for the person on the last mile. You have to write emails, you have to know exactly the cause of your complaint, and you need to know the exact ombudsman that you need to reach out to. And all of these definitely extort a lot of cognitive bandwidth for the person at the last mile, and then complaints can get rejected for not having cited the correct ground or for not even going to the right jurisdiction. So we do think that right now there is a learning curve and we need to be far more receptive. I mean, not that we aren't already, but we need to be more receptive to the experience on the ground where people are definitely citing these bottlenecks as reasons why they would not even go and seek redress to begin with. This becomes more important in digital because then people ultimately fall back on the alternative of cash. So our research, for instance, migrant women households in garment factories in Gurgaon show that Gurgaon is a small kind of town of NCR in India for those of us joining from outside. And this government migrant women cohort basically suggested that they would rather pay a premium to kind of wire money back to their hometowns via an agent, because then they have a person on the hook and they can actually reach out to them and see where their money was kind of stuck. So I think I'll save other research for later, but I do think that there is a need for grievance redress to be very integrated at the front end, and the person who is actually providing the kind of financial service should also have a means to provide redress or route people to redress. It should not fall on consumers to find where they can go to get redress, and it should not be a drastically different process altogether. We do hear that there's a lot of automation going on. Then is there a way that the consumer can actually approach a single stop entity for all kinds of complaints, and then with significant automation, can that entity route consumers' complaints to relevant entities or regulators? I think that is what is going to make consumers' life easier. The last thing that I want to say just on grievance redress is that we also find that there is a discontinuity in the way grievance redresses are designed for digital. What I really mean is that while we have kind of thought of an onboarding process that is end-to-end digital, we fall back on the physical visit the branch process for grievance redress. We saw this in the case of AEPS, Aadhaar-enabled payment systems. These were the systems that were used most widely for the low-income household and individual who wanted to kind of avail of the government relief during COVID. And these were, in fact, the only means to get your kind of government allotment, because banks were not operating full hours due to COVID-induced lockdowns. And what then happened was that if you had faced a transaction failure or if you were charged wrongly, then the chargeback form had to be filled at the branch office. And there is no way that the agent who's actually giving you the money can actually can register your complaint or initiate redress for you right on the ground then and there. So I think these kind of discontinuities where onboarding is digital, but grievance redress is almost treated, as a second preference. We need to kind of bridge those gaps and make grievance redress as easy, if not more, than onboarding. And it has to be elevated from being an afterthought to almost a precondition of providing the financial service.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. In fact, to your point, one of the things we've learned in our work on government technologies, more broadly around public grievance redressal, is that there is a tendency very much to fall back on networks on the ground for seeking, because like you said, there's a person on the hook, there's a certain visibility into the problem. So while bringing somebody digital is one question, ensuring that there are the right set of mechanisms to ensure there's trust to continue to use these digital services is critical. But, I'd like to sort of pull the discussion and ask Nath this, because all of this in a certain way is ring-fenced or sort of bounded by or framed by the constraints that the industry operates in. So if you could, Nath, talk a little bit more about some of these constraints that industry operates with, and then we can begin to have a more meaningful discussion about how consumer protection can be understood. So over to you, Nath.
Thanks, Sarayu, and Ranjeeta and Beni set the context very nicely. So I'll speak from a practitioner's point of view, more focus on digital payments and broadly a little bit of FinTech. So very quick background, PayPal, we have been in operation for 20 years globally, operating currently in 200 countries for 300 plus million users transact globally on our network. In India, very quick, for the for the people who are hearing and not know what we have been up to. Last 10 years, we have a laser focus on small and medium businesses in India. Many of them women enterprises. I would emphasize the word micro in our definition of MSME. Most of them are our clients. What they use PayPal for is we give them access to a global customer base. They sell their goods and services abroad, and they earn, and we help them facilitate export earnings back into India. So valuable foreign exchange, job creation, and a whole new channel of exporting to global consumers. So while we do that, we think from a lens that when we say consumer protection, it also needs to address the small businesses, because remember, they are also consumers in their own right, but the small business also is equally constrained with whatever Ranjeeta and Beni quite nicely put out. So we need to keep these two communities the most vulnerable in mind as we think about it. Now, the way we have been thinking and and looking at consumer protection, redressal is a very important pillar, no doubt about it. But the way we think about it is, what can you do before the transaction is happening on our platform? What do you do during the transaction? And then, control a lot of issues upstream so that the redressal mechanism is, kind of managed, in a much more better fashion. So you need to look at end to end. Number two, the data that has come out during the COVID. Okay, I can talk about my platform, and that will kind of give a sense for the tier group as well, whether it's global or Indian. What we have seen during COVID is digital payments was an important facet before COVID. Now it's almost essential. People have to send money to their friends and relatives, and you use digital payments to buy or pay for anything, right? Or small businesses have to receive payments. Whatever RBI along with the government has set up a digital infrastructure is coming very, very handy and very critical during this phase. So we have seen unprecedented traffic on our platform. So something like globally, we are looking at, seeing 200,000 customers every day, new users. Number two, we are on track to cross $1 trillion on a global platform in terms of processing. That's a very humongous number. Per second, we are close to doing about $30,000 per second. That's the kind of scale we are operating globally. And it's quite kind of unprecedented because, like I said, it's become essential. Now, when we start to look at, this unprecedented usage, what we found is very interesting is, new segment of customers are coming online. Let me give you one example. What we have named them just for convenience sake is the silver tech shoppers. Okay. Silver tech is typically 50 to 80 age group. They were very comfortable doing transactions offline, either in cash or go across to the nearest store. But now it has become essential that they transact online. Like Beni said, and you said, Sarayu, the level of knowledge on digital, the endowment, the access, the technology, whether it's in India or overseas, we see a common problem. And what we are also seeing, the good part is when digital transaction and digital payments have really exploded, the dark side of it is coming to the fore, okay, which is around bad actors, fraud and financial crime perpetrators are seeing this unprecedented opportunity and to come and, take advantage of this kind of, new segment of users who may not be very familiar. So how are we going to tackle it? So this is what we as a practitioners and the industry is grappling with. And what we have done proactively is over the years is said that if I'm a digital platform, it is not enough to just have user onboarding digital, help them transact digital, but also the entire online dispute resolution has to be digital. So we have put some tools out there. Okay. So PayPal, we put this policy in our contract that anybody who uses PayPal up to 180 days can dispute a transaction. Okay. On top of it, you have a buyer protection. So if you're a consumer, for valid transaction, come and dispute the transaction within 180 days to say that, unauthorized transaction item not received or the supplier didn't send the item as it was described. Okay, so this, and then what we have also done is, at the front end, help with tools like, if we send a mail from PayPal, the user can actually, we give some indicators. They can use the app and put it on the email and check whether it's valid from PayPal. Because the most common way, in spite of all security features that you can build in, is phishing, okay, or smishing or wishing. people just, give away all their credentials, whether it is OTP, password, CVV, whatnot. It's like almost opening your front door and letting the bad actor come in. After that, you can put any amount of security. It's not going to help. So we have put some tools out there in terms of, how it can help the end user to kind of, use very simple stuff and, try and protect. In addition to all sort of education, which whether it's the government, RBI or the industry is doing. So the point I'm trying to make here is that to Beni's point, we need to look at it end to end. Okay, look at pre, during, post in terms of fraud protection and fraud prevention. Give them the tools which are easy to use and give them digital, online dispute resolution, which can again be completely digital at the first level. Of course, all the other, redressal multi-tiered mechanism that the regulator so rightfully is putting through is also available. But what can we do to take ownership? So I would end this my commentary by saying that time has moved that, caveat emptor kind of a thing to caveat vendor. Okay. We are building the products. This new set of users are not very familiar. So it's my onus to say that what can we do to keep them, safe and sound. So digital trust and confidence is the responsibility of the service provider, the supply side to take the first initiative. Over to you, Sarayu.
Thank you. I was also struggling with unmuting myself, but thank you very much. And, that is the practical set of constraints within which the industry operates. And being cognizant of this with the need for sort of empowerment and access for a wider range of consumers is actually very critical. You brought up a point in the earlier part of your conversation around the experiences of small businesses. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges they experience differentiated from individual customers, because that segment in a certain way is fairly under-researched, as also in some ways invisible as well. While we are starting to get some early insight and empirical evidence about how individuals experience these breakdowns, for smaller companies, what resources do they have at their disposal and what challenges do they face?
So Sarayu, the answer is in your query that you post. Okay, the biggest single challenge that we see is that all of them know the benefits and it's almost essential for them to go digital. And our role is to even help them go international. Okay, what we have observed, number one, is that this small businesses, they don't have the talent. Okay, to really adopt digital, stay and grow on digital. Many times, the individual owner is trying to do, it's an individual owned business. Okay. They are trying to do everything, right? From manufacturing to marketing to delivering. Okay. When it goes to digital, they are simply not aware about all the redressal mechanisms, the tools, and, they don't even have people who are adequately trained within their staff to delegate some of the tasks. Okay. So we see that as a, big challenge of how do you kind of skill development, not only for them or the 2 or 3 member team. That's number one. A lot of the education that we do as an industry, government or regulator is focused around consumer, but businesses have a little bit of a cultural and, social issue. They don't want to really go to their banker, okay, or, to the regulator immediately for the fear that, they have to disclose a lot of things. Okay. It's a little bit of, informal to formal journey. Okay. And they feel that, sometimes they may have missed something in the process, so they are not going to get that, protection. So there is a little bit of that hesitancy that we see in terms of availing these redressal mechanisms. So that's the second challenge that we are seeing. The third one is, again, they also deserve some sort of a protection. See, we miss the point that only buyers can get defrauded. What we have seen is the small business can also get defrauded. They get calls and they have much more to lose. Say 10 lakh, 20 lakh in his bank account, right? Which is say $50,000. Now that could result in that his whole business could fold up if there is a fraud. Okay, so what we have tried to do from our end is, like I said, buyer protection. We also have seller protection. So we tell the exporter here, the small business, that, if there is a fraudulent transaction by a buyer or a potential buyer abuse, do call us for valid transaction. We'll kind of make sure the chargeback doesn't come to you. So we'll reduce your loss, on that. So those are the kind of mechanisms that we are thinking. But quite rightly, they are challenged with talent, a little bit of hesitancy in revealing everything. Okay, they are, because they don't want to go fully formal for the other risks that they perceive, and then they are having to delegate and not being able to trust their own staff, and is there adequate training. These are some of the issues that we are seeing coming out to the fore.
Right. Thank you very much for that. That paints a very clear picture. I'd like to take this discussion a little bit on small businesses, staying with this before we come back to individual customers. I'd like to take this discussion to Ms. Ranjeeta and ask, and this comes from wanting to understand the regulatory framework a little bit more. The regulatory protections that are available to some of these small businesses, do they vary? Is the approach different? Or is the Charter of Consumer Rights, as the RBI has articulated and you sort of mentioned, is that similarly placed for both individual customers as well as small businesses, which are particularly vulnerable relative to others? Over to you.
So, Sarayu, yes, these customer protection initiatives that I spoke about, especially the banking ombudsman scheme or the other consumer education centers that I talked about, education and protection cells. So they are available to the small businesses as well. So, it is for the individual customer as well as the small businesses. I think it would not matter much to the larger businesses to come to such a platform, to seek redress, because they already have such agreements within themselves. But yes, and small businesses are utilizing this ombudsman scheme and the other grievance redressal mechanism from this effect. Yes.
Right. As always, this toggling between mute and unmute causes a fair amount of confusion. But, I'd love to sort of take this. Now we're almost halfway through, but start to talk a little bit about how some of these questions and challenges around consumer protection might begin to get addressed. My question is to you, Beni. You started to talk about it, but if you could speak a little bit more about some of these breakdowns that exist on the ground in being able to access grievance redressal mechanisms and more broadly mechanisms for consumer protection. So if you could talk to issues of awareness as well as access, and we could then think of ways both in design and from the industry perspective as well as from the regulatory perspective that could start to solve this. But over to you, Beni.
I think that the learning curve is a bit long. It's flatter than we'd like to be when it comes to serving digital at the last mile, because we do see that there are not very many feedback mechanisms that we can avail of in terms of, even researchers. So for instance, a grievance redress data or just the kind of complaints that are coming to different regulators or to different banks, they're not in public domain and they're not very easy to sift through. So a lot of our evidence is actually based on smaller primary studies, and we do see that unfortunately a lot what exists on the ground is less kind of pitched at comprehension, at improving the comprehension, consumers' comprehension, and more at like ticking off the compliance requirements set out by the regulator. And if really our objective is to move from financial inclusion to financial well-being, then we have to see that what is the impact of those policies on the person or on the last mile consumer herself. So if I were to say a few things, how can we make finance then more responsible, or how can we then march on to financial well-being? I think the first kind of dimension of responsible would have 2 to 3 layers for me. The most integral one is grievance redress. It's great to have a range of ex-post toolkit from limited liability to all kinds of mechanisms that you can offer consumer. But the point is, if they do not feel confident enough to raise a grievance, then I think we've lost that battle. So just making grievance redress more approachable, and in a way that's designed for the consumer, I think is top of mind. Second is the consent architecture. Like we've heard it at multiple forums over the years that consent is broken, and we do kind of see the proofs of it now. So, for instance, if I were to tell you that when we went to the ground for this same primary study, we found that only about 24% people knew that financial institutions actually used their personal data. And a comparable 20% people said that they didn't know. So it's not like any of these financial products were being offered without consent, but it just shows the effectiveness of that consent. And again, of those 24%, it's anybody's guess how many of them actually got to know of the practices of the financial institution from the consent form itself, right? And how much was just acquired knowledge. So clearly, these things need to be reworked, and we have a great occasion. I think COVID presents that opportunity to take a step back because, like I said, the hard job of bringing everyone online seems to be in striking distance now. So then what should consent then look like? So I think another qualitative study that we did actually way back in 2017 showed that many of our stakeholders that we care about, the low-income stakeholders in remote rural India, are not educated, but the consent forms continue to remain verbose, and they continue to be legal instruments that need to be read. So can we then have video consent? Can we have more graphic representation of consent? And these are ideas that we are internally right now tweaking and perhaps doing planning a research on. But of course, we do know the direction of travel. The idea is how can we then make scalable and kind of relevant for both providers and consumers at the last mile. I think just going vernacular will not help. If we have to actually make a difference at the last mile, we will have to look beyond just literally written out consent forms. The second kind of dimension of being responsible is also how the user interface itself is designed. If so many of us are first-time users of digital interfaces and then first-time users of formal finance, then the intersectionality, Sarayu, that you just talked of at the beginning of the session is just so much more accentuated, right? And I think there, how we present terms of loans, how we present the onboarding, how we present the penalties, we need to be very careful about what we are communicating and how that is being comprehended at the last mile. We do see in other jurisdictions that dark patterns are being deployed heavily to make people sign up for expensive loans, expensive payday lending. And though, we might decide that this is not a regulatory priority for us simply because of the scale, these are things that we have to be aware of as we kind of scale and reach the last mile. I think the last point in terms of just responsible digital finance, but it's also more than responsible. It's also just sustainable financial inclusion, is that we have to be aware of our digital divides. It is great to have that complete digital ambition, but our research shows how women's use of mobile phones is very different from men's use of mobile phones. Women tend to have more antiquated, obsolete handsets. They tend to use fewer features even if they have the same handset. And for most times, especially for financial apps, we do see it's the male, either the partner or the brother or the father who actually sets up the financial app on the phone. And then most often the apps are linked to the male counterparts' mobile bank accounts. So then I think as we tread digital, we have to be careful. Are we undoing the financial inclusion battle that we fought on the ground, by bringing women in the ambit of physical finance and, making sure every woman has a bank account. But ultimately, if your remittance apps are linked to your male counterparts, then have we then kind of taken away that agency a little bit? And these are of course philosophical questions, but I do think that a lot of them might have design solutions. If we are able to somehow provide for 2 bank accounts with the same app, then maybe the second option is the woman's bank account, right? So I think there are these kinds of challenges, and if we really have to make digital finance inclusive, then these are important. The last, which has a huge bearing on my mind, it's topical but also enduring, is we have to make sure that digital finance is sustainable, because what we are seeing is that a lot of costs are currently being internalized either by providers or by governments and regulators. And right now, consumers are finding it very attractive, but we worry that this is not financially sustainable. So we might migrate everybody to digital finance, and after 4 years, we might start externalizing those costs to the consumer, when falling back on cash may not be an option. So can we be more careful about business viability and make sure that we are kind of discussing this more deeply about what are the business models that can be allowed, securing for consumers protection, not foregoing consumers protection, but allowing providers to actually stay in the business, because in the long run, this will have an impact both on systemic stability and consumer protection. So yeah, top of mind are basically onboarding processes, grievance redresses, and sustainability.
Right. No, thank you very much. And this resonates in part with the work that we're doing on GovTech, and in general, the broader views on what it means to bring women onto digital platforms, whether in the context of finance or more broadly. But my next question is to Nath, building on some of what Beni has spoken about. What opportunities, you did speak to them a little bit in the earlier part of this conversation, Nath, but if you could talk a little bit more about what can be done from the design side, on the practitioner side. We have spoken in earlier conversations about privacy by design, but how can some of these values around inclusion be encoded in the imagination of financial technology products themselves? Over to you, Nath.
So Sarayu, thanks Beni for highlighting the issues, right? So like I said, if we take this caveat vendor kind of a principle, okay, it just makes business sense to make it very transparent. But the only way we can win trust and confidence of a repeat use, how does he stay with us and how do you build a relationship, is only possible when you make it easy, but at the same time secure. The mandate the user gives to us in a digital payment transaction is, it's a dull part of any transaction. Okay, trust me. Okay, we have less than 2 seconds to actually determine whether it's a good transaction. The user wants to just see that it is successful, and money has been debited and credited, right, for both the parties. Okay, and so within that time frame, what we have to do is make it very easy, at the same time very secure. Okay, and then have this robust redressal mechanism kicking in if required for those set of transactions. So it's a challenge that is posed to us as practitioners. So how do you think about it? To me, first is, it's not about the product, it is about the culture, right? And then and that needs to reflect in your products and user experience. So what is the culture? The culture has to be, we are in the space of digital finance. Within that digital payments, we are dealing with a very emotive and a very valuable issue for the user. That is his money, right? And it's a very hard-earned money. So one is security by design and privacy by design. These are the two things that we keep in mind. How does it translate into product? First is, I'm just again using PayPal as an example. Many in our industry try to kind of, imbibe that and try to have those products. What we have learned over the years, making mistakes, to be honest, is reached the stage where we said, can you do shop without sharing? So users' card details are protected with us with all the appropriate security standards. We never share this data with the merchant. Okay, so the merchant doesn't need to know that which card was used by Ranjeeta, for example. Okay, why does he need to know? What he's interested is he should get the money. PayPal will guarantee him that money, okay, in his bank account. Similarly, why should the user know which bank account of the merchant is? So we call it shop without sharing. Very simple for user to understand. It's already built in. Okay. I've already then come to privacy. Very important aspect. Okay, we have to be very clear in our policy. What information is collected? Why are we collecting it for? How is it going to be used? too. So if you take our privacy policy, of course, there is always room for improvement. You can see the list of fields we collect. We say, whom do we share it with, under what conditions? Okay. And the only reason like us collect the data, we say that the data given to us by the user is sacrosanct. Okay. Then they give it only for two reasons. One is to process the data, which means you have instructed us to say, pay this guy so much. Okay. So processing the data, processing and providing the service is why we collect the data. Number two is to protect him from fraud and financial crime. So it is with that philosophy we'll need to approach this issue. Now, some of the ways I explained to you how we have built this into the design and the product itself. On the privacy side, we have gone one step ahead and said you can log into our product and use a notification and say that you don't want to receive any notifications of any product offering, promotions, or anything from PayPal itself. Forget about third parties. So we have given the kind of control to the user and said that you can decide what is right for you. If you don't want any promotional offers, then please feel free to take charge. So these are some of the things that we have been thinking about, from how do we become trustees of the data? How do you build things in the design itself? How do you give control to the user? Are the policies very clear about, how the information that is giving us is put to use? Okay, all that is a part of the contract and terms of service. But to Beni's point, is that the perfect situation? No, things are evolving. So how do we go about, and keep on adjusting this, look at global best practices and say that what's come from, say, the India's proposed draft data protection policy, or what is GDPR? Can we look the best elements and apply it globally across all of our data? So it's an ongoing exercise. But, what I said is, how do you fix this in the product itself? And in the experience goes a long way. Sarayu, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Nat. That was very helpful in understanding what opportunities, PayPal's approach to this, but more broadly, what opportunities exist at the industry level in order to address some of these concerns. That for me raises a concern partly from what the comments that Beni made about the actual comprehensibility and accessibility of these things, but also from the regulatory perspective. And so my question is to Ms. Ranjeeta over here, to understand a little bit more of, how do regulators navigate the situation in terms of when design becomes a sort of starting point, or almost like a defense to say we've designed for this from the security perspective, so now we are not liable to go beyond. So how do regulators navigate some of these concerns? So hoping to have a look into the regulators' mindset in thinking about some of these questions, not in a futuristic sense, but in the everyday sense of dealing with some of these concerns. So over to you, Ms. Ranjeeta.
So while I'll get to your point, there was one point I thought I would just clarify, regarding lodging of complaints with the email and all that. So the Reserve Bank has launched a complaint management system. So it's a portal on which all the complaints can be lodged directly. It's a structured format, very easy to navigate, to go through. It allows end-to-end processing. And what we've seen over the year is that the complainants have actually moved from email and physical onto this portal to try to make it easier for the customers. Regarding the other point is about the grievance redressal of a product. So it has to be ensured at the launch of a product that the issues relating to grievance redressal are provided upfront. And, through the various changes that Reserve Bank itself did in the ombudsman schemes. So, issues like mis-selling, etc., which were not earlier in the scheme. And all of them have been added onto the scheme. So, and as regards, Beni, very interesting inputs, regarding the grievance redressal not being on digital platform for the regulated, for the customers at the ground level. So in that context, and in the context of, Sarayu, your question, So, this national strategy for financial education, it's actually a vision of the government of India and the regulators, the RBI, SEBI, the insurance regulator and the pension fund regulator. It's a multi-stakeholder-led approach for financial awareness. And I agree that financial well-being can only be established when, you have financial awareness, you are financially included, and you have the means to consumer protection. Now, the strategic objectives of this national strategy for financial education that has been laid out, which is, for the year 2020 to 2025, is, the various objectives, if I can just point them, which are relevant from the our point of discussion for today, to inculcate financial literacy of concepts amongst the various sections, to encourage active savings, to encourage credit discipline, to develop, credit discipline, and to improve usage of digital services in a safe and secure manner, manage risks at various stages of the life, and plan for old age retirement, knowledge about rights, duties, and avenues for grievance redressal. It is part of the National Strategy for Financial Education of India, which will run from 2020 to 2025. It has various dimensions. The first dimension is that it should address children, young adults, the entrepreneurs, and senior citizens differently. It should have a difference in geography. So one geographical location could have different vulnerabilities. For example, Northeast could have different vulnerabilities that are different from that in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And so, and then, difference in occupation. So agriculturists may have a different requirement, and the MSMEs and small businesses may have a different requirement. So, and all this is to be achieved through the 5 C's that they say: content, capacity, community, communication, and collaboration. So content is that all of them will together prepare the content, and they will also, at the same time, they will look at the enhancing the capacity of the intermediaries who are going to be involved in providing these financial services. They would like to leverage the role of the communities. The communities, it should be a community-led model, and through appropriate communication, and there should be collaboration amongst the various stakeholders, which is the government and all the regulators. So one agrees that there is still scope for a lot of financial education at the lowest level, at all the levels, not just the it's not just the far-flung areas. If I may, we receive so many complaints from educated people saying that I was supposed to receive some funds and I have clicked on a QR code, so they wouldn't know that if you're receiving funds, why should you click a QR code? Things like that. So it's different for different people, but they must all be given the right kind of education, so that we are all, we all develop over the. And for the regulator, let me tell you that there is no, let go of an issue. So, if there is a case where there is a data privacy issue or something, so from the point of the regulator, that's a very, very serious issue. And if we talk about, I would just say that the Reserve Bank is now also coming up with a digital payment security control direction. Very soon it is coming up. We already have the online dispute resolution mechanism, which we have said should come live from 1st January. And it has to start with the failed transactions. So it should help people on the ground, so that their disputes should be online. And so that's where we're looking at, through proper education and inclusion. And the Reserve Bank also, we started with Centers for Financial Literacy. We started it as a pilot project. Earlier, we extended it to 80 districts and then to 20 more districts. But now it has been decided that this should be extended to all the blocks in the country in a phased manner by March 2024. So, this should, these should make some difference, And one should try and see. And the what Beni spoke about is the impact of all these strategies should be known. So, as a fallout of the earlier strategy of financial education, the digital financial services was included in this 5-year strategy. So, it was considered that this is an important aspect that all the regulators and government need to consider. So that is.
Right. Thank you very much for that comment, Ms. Ranjeeta. And you mentioned communities coming together and being more thoughtful of bringing in different stakeholders' voices and thinking about this question. And that's as a researcher and as somebody who strongly believes in multiple entities coming together to think about these things, that sounds like music to my ears. We are at 8 minutes from log off, and I'm reliably informed that my video is not working. But I had one last question to all the panelists, and this is a little bit of wishful thinking. But if there is sort of one area or one pathway, given the frames of thinking about empowerment, thinking about greater agency, thinking about financial well-being, is there, one area or one avenue that we need to drill down upon in the next 1 year? What would that be according to you? And then, if you could take a minute and a half and then we log off. Over to you, Ms. Ranjeeta first, and then Nath and Beni, if that's possible. Ranjeeta? Right. While we wait, Nath, may I request you to weigh in on this?
Sarayu, that's you have asked for one thing and stick, but I'll try my best. So one thing that jumps at my mind is we are looking at this end-to-end picture, right? Upfront, what you can do at the design, what you can do during the transaction, and then very strong redressal measures within and outside, right? Whatever is available as redressal mechanism. One area that really as a community we need to work on, number one, if I may say, number two being education, right? Which is again an industry, regulator, government effort. Okay, maybe sustained over 5-7 years. But the immediate one with that strikes me is that everyone is going digital, using digital payments. An area which is a very big problem is that, how do you get law enforcement collaboration going? Okay, users need to be very comfortable in filing complaints online. That also needs to go online. Number two is the confidence can only be, converted into a virtuous cycle if their complaints are getting addressed. You find investigation and actual prosecution. Okay, currently the laws themselves are weak. Law enforcement capacity, which is a state subject, is a challenge. And, though the mechanisms are going digital, some very good efforts by MHA, cybercrime.gov, and also some of the more forward-looking states going online. There is much needs to be done in terms of capacity building of the LE, taking these systems online. How do you get them to investigate in a timely fashion, get people to actually file complaints and then prosecute and carry through? That's an area that I think requires a lot more thinking as a community of all the stakeholders that I mentioned. We have done some work while recently launching a report with the SEI, talks about emerging fraud and the role of law enforcement. But that's an area for a lot of thinking.
Right. Thank you. That's a very important area and not often spoken about. But may I hand over to Beni to jump in?
Yeah. Okay. I think, my wish list would just be designing processes, keeping consumer left, right, and center, and making sure that the onboarding process, the grievance redress process, are as seamless as they can be, and they're designed from the consumer perspective. I also think that this is an opportunity for us to kind of expand on some of the regulatory language and think of what would suitability, for instance, mean for digital financial services. And it would mean if it is to kind of offer a financial product relevant to the consumer circumstance, then that circumstance also takes into account the kind of vernacular preferences of the consumer, the internet bandwidth, and more importantly, think of transition to digital. We want it to be a fast one, but still think of it as a process, as a transition, and therefore keep alternatives ready as and when consumers face issues. They should have on-hand support, they should have on-hand redress, and actually redress along the life cycle. So more like a frequently asked question plus redress type of situation where there is constant help along the process of the transaction to make the new experience more comfortable and more trust inspiring. And if I can have one more, then of course data protection and privacy, because it has gone from a legal construct to a very kind of revealed preference of the consumer. New research out of Bangalore and Kenya shows that people are actually willing to pay more for financial services that protect their privacy. And I think that's a takeaway for all of us, consumer advocates, providers, regulators, that this should, again, not be an afterthought, but something we design for.
Right. No, absolutely. That I feel like I've heard my own wish list being reiterated. I'm going to just check in if Ranjeeta can unmute herself. I believe she was struggling.
Yes, thank you. So, 1 year down the line, I would, as Beni stated, that there were issues in the consumer protection, the ombudsman scheme, jurisdictions and grounds. I would wish that we are able to bring some change to the customers at the ground level. And the other thing is the awareness. So that's something that we would like to engage the customers of NBFCs and system participants, wallets, to be more aware. So that is where I hope and feel that the next year we could bring some improvement upon.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. No, absolutely.
Sarayu, I must also say, just add, Sarayu, if I may, I'll just add a couple of things. RBI, to whatever Ranjeeta said. One was this ODR, which is a welcome step, online dispute resolution.
Right.
What we also quite liked about is the RBI's payment vision document. Okay,
Right.
It again goes into the spirit of saying that what can we do upstream and upfront to stop and reduce both business and technical declines.
Right.
There are very clear goals to bring down business decline, technical decline, fraud as goals as well. So,
Right.
the vision is there from RBI. The service providers have to take the initiative to build this into the design and go forward and adopt. To Beni's point, customers feel that there is a service provider whom they can trust, may be willing to stay with us for a long time, and we give them the confidence. So, also very, very welcome steps and environment.
Right. Right. Thank you, Nat, for this. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I feel like this can go on for much, much longer if we were given the chance. But we are at time now, and indeed, this is given the digitization post-COVID, this is indeed a time for everybody, the industry, those involved in research, those working in consumer protection, and for regulators to come together to have a robust, sound, constructive, and friction-filled discussion on what consumer protection can look like over the next few decades as more and more people go digital. So thank you very much. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I hope we can continue to talk about these things going forward. Thank you for your time, everyone.